In the last lesson, we went through some of the basics of the endocrine system, including a little overview of the hormones and where they're released from. But in this lesson, we're going to really focus on how hormones themselves work and the two particular types in this course. So, to start us off, how do hormones work? Well, in our last lesson, we learned that hormones are released by this thing called the endocrine system. And this endocrine system is made up of a series of glands which release hormones into the blood. Hormones will then travel through the blood until they reach a particular target cell or target organ. So in this diagram on the right here, we can actually see, firstly, I'll underline this in yellow, the cell which is producing a particular hormone. And this hormone then travels from that cell into the bloodstream where it is transported by these blood vessels, and eventually they leave the bloodstream when they reach a particular target cell. Not just any cell in the body, they are looking for a particular cell. And that target cell is complementary or has complementary receptors to the hormone that is being released. Now why? Well, hormones are there to firstly change the function of cells, okay? And they can do this by changing the type, the activity, or the quantity of, and I'll underline this in red here, protein produced. So, what are some of the other things that hormones can do when they're changing these proteins and which ones are produced? Number one, they can activate a particular gene, and this will produce a particular protein. Secondly, they can change the rate of transcription or translation, something that you might be familiar with from year 11, and changing the rate of transcription or translation of particular proteins and protein synthesis. Lastly, they can change the shape or the structure of an enzyme. Again, enzymes being a concept from year 11, so let me underline these concepts from year 11 here for you. And when it changes the shape or the structure of this enzyme, it can either turn it off or turn it on. So here's another diagram representing some of the different ways that hormones can travel. So again, over on the left, we have our original endocrine cells. These endocrine cells release this hormone into the bloodstream when they travel through the blood until they reach this target cell. So target cell over on the right of our diagram, and over on the left we have the endocrine cell releasing it. But how are these hormones told when to release? How are they communicated with so that they can trigger another reaction? Well, there's three different ways, and this is what we're going to go through on this slide right here now. So firstly, there is a hormonal stimuli. And when you think of hormonal stimuli, you can think of a hormone triggering the action of another hormone. So a particular example of this instance is something called TSH, which we'll get into in a few lessons' time. TSH stands for thyroid stimulating hormone, and it triggers the thyroid to release other hormones like thyroxine. The second form of endocrine signaling that we can talk about is a humoral response. And a humoral response is a change in the levels of ions and or nutrients found in the blood, and that stimulates a particular endocrine gland to release a particular hormone. So an example of this is antidiuretic hormone, which we will talk about later on down the track. Finally, the last example that we're going to talk about today is a neural stimulation, and this becomes really important. Sorry, we won't use pink there, that's not very good. We might switch this one out for blue instead. A neural stimuli is where nerve fibers themselves stimulate a hormone being released. So an example of this is going to be the adrenal medulla releasing adrenaline, and this is innervated by the nervous system itself. So we've already alluded to this idea that hormones have a particular target cell. But more importantly than that, hormones have complementary receptors. And the key word here is complementary. They fit together almost like a lock and a key. Now, hormones can affect lots of different parts of the body as long as a particular complementary receptor is found on that cell. So when we talk about these cells, we can see in this diagram on the top half of the screen, I'll draw a yellow box around it for us now, we can see that this particular hormone is released by this secreting cell. This secreting cell is an example of our endocrine cell. And this could be any endocrine cell found throughout the body. So in the pituitary gland, the thyroid gland, so on and so forth. And what we can see about this hormone is it has this unique structure. And this unique structure is complementary to this receptor that I'll highlight in blue on this particular cell. You'll notice that the cell in the bottom right of this yellow box does not have the complementary receptor, and so that this hormone will not have a response. We can also see, if we turn our attention now to the box on the bottom, so I've circled this one in green now, that target cells can have one receptor or multiple receptors. So we can see here that target cell for hormone A, this one on the left, let's call this cell 1, has receptors only for hormone A. And as such, it is only going to receive messages thanks to hormone A. When we look at the one on the far right, target cell number 3, target cell number 3 only has receptors for hormone B. The unique one, and the one that we're really interested in right now though, is target cell 2. Target cell 2 has receptors for both hormone B and hormone A, and so it can be affected by more than one hormone. But again, these hormones must have a particular receptor, a complementary receptor on the surface of the cell. Now, when we talk about hormones, they work in two particular different ways. And they work in different ways depending on whether or not they are firstly water soluble or secondly lipid soluble. We're going to have some different names introduced now for water soluble hormones and for lipid soluble hormones, but at their core, both water and lipid work in a slightly different way, and that is what we need to make particular note of. So let's get started now with a water soluble hormone. A water soluble hormone may also appear to be named a protein hormone or an amine hormone. The reasoning for this is that these particular hormones can be in the form of a protein or amine. They are made up from amino acids, and all of these things cannot cross the phospholipid bilayer. So you may remember the phospholipid bilayer from year 11 human biology, and you may remember that this is made up of these lipid molecules, okay, these hydrophobic molecules scared of water. When we talk about these water-soluble hormones, then they can't cross this bilayer, so there needs to be some different mechanism in place for the hormone to have an effect on this cell. What we do know about these hormones is that they act very quickly, however they have quite short-lasting effects. So let's talk through now how they actually work. Number one, these hormones travel through the blood and they are dissolved in the blood plasma. Blood plasma being a majority water, these water-soluble hormones can dissolve in the blood plasma. Secondly, when they come to the complementary receptor on the cell membrane or the cell surface of a particular target cell, it creates and forms something known as a hormone receptor complex. This receptor complex is what we may refer to as the first messenger, but we're not too worried about this name. When we do worry about the naming of messengers is in step 3. Because once this first messenger has formed, it causes what is known as a secondary messenger to diffuse into the cell. Because the hormone receptor complex is water soluble, it cannot diffuse through that phospholipid bilayer, so it sends another hormone in its place. It sends a secondary messenger, and this secondary messenger again diffuses into the cell. Once the secondary messenger has diffused into the cell, it will then go and activate particular enzymes to catalyze reactions inside of the cell cytoplasm. As a consequence, it has now altered the activity of this particular cell. So some examples of some water-soluble hormones include things like follicle-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, prolactin, and all of these different ones that I've mentioned down below. So when we talk about our we'll keep going with amine and protein action. A particular example that you might like to do some looking into is cyclic AMP and its formation. We can see in this diagram the hormone up the top of the screen, if I circle it in red right now, travels through the blood dissolved in plasma. It binds to a receptor on the cell surface, a complementary receptor on the cell surface, and it can't travel in. But it does result in the formation of a secondary messenger. So in this case, the secondary messenger is that cyclic AMP, and cyclic AMP will then have an effect on cell metabolism. Here's another representation of that one here. If you're interested, feel free to pause the slide at this point in time. But for now, what we'll do is we will move on to our lipid-soluble, or the other name for lipid-soluble being steroid hormones. Now, lipid-soluble hormones, as you can imagine, are made up of a form of fat, and that form of fat is cholesterol. The benefit of lipid-soluble hormones is that they can cross the phospholipid bilayer as they are lipid-soluble. And inversely, compared to our water-soluble hormones, they are slow-acting, but they do have longer-lasting effects. So, in order to travel through the blood, lipid-soluble hormones cannot dissolve in blood plasma. What they need to do instead is that they bind to transport proteins found in the blood. When they get to the cell, they have a bit of an easier job though, and they can diffuse straight across the cell membrane and enter that target cell. Once they're inside the cell, the hormone will attach to a receptor, and that receptor is found in the cytoplasm, or, in this case, the nuclear membrane. And this is when the hormone receptor complex is formed. Once the hormone receptor complex has been formed, it's going to enter the nucleus of that cell, and the complex will bind to the DNA. It's going to activate or inhibit genes. So it's going to activate or inhibit transcription. And this, in turn, is going to alter protein synthesis, leading to the creation or subsequent less creation of particular proteins. So some examples of hormones, again, include things like estrogen, progesterone, cortisol, and aldosterone. So when we have a look at this one here, we can see up the top, we have our steroid hormone over on the left-hand side. This steroid hormone has now arrived at this cell bound to a transport protein in the blood. It then passes through the cell membrane nice and easily, and in this particular instance, it is bound to a steroid receptor found in the cytoplasm. This then travels through the nuclear pores of the nuclear membrane into the nucleus, where it can bind to the DNA, influencing transcription. This will then eventually lead to a difference in protein synthesis. As we scroll down here, we can now see both forms of transport going on. So up the top, we have protein or amine hormones. Protein or amine, as you remember, are our water-soluble hormones. And down the bottom of our diagram, we can also see, in blue, we can see this steroid hormone instead. So let me just highlight this other line as well. So overall, I'm going to finish it on this slide here. Again, just another visual representation showing the differences in how steroid and non-steroid hormones